Money usually buys silence. $1 million buys a new life. But when the man sliding the check across the counter is responsible for half the missing persons posters in the West End, you have a choice to make. Take the cash and lose your soul, or say no and lose your life. Nora Hayes said no. Everyone expected a funeral. What happened instead brought the entire city to a dead stop. The smell of motor oil and burnt coffee was baked into the cinder block walls of Hayes Automotive. Nora wiped a streak of grease from her forehead with the back of a gloved hand, staring down at the cracked distributor cap of a '92 Honda. The radio in the corner hummed with a low, static-laced jazz tune. Outside, the city was drowning in a relentless October rain. It was 10 at night. She should have locked up 3 hours ago. But Det didn't sleep, and neither did she. The heavy bay doors rattled. Then the rhythmic, heavy hum of luxury engines drowned out the rain. Nora paused her wrench, hovering over the engine bay. Nobody brought their car to a rusted-out shop on 4th Street at this hour unless they were dumping it. She grabbed the heavy steel tire iron from the rack, wiping her hands on a shop rag, and walked out to the main floor. 3 black SUVs were parked in a tight herringbone formation across her cracked asphalt lot. The headlights cut through the downpour, illuminating the dust motes dancing in her garage. Doors opened. Car doors closing in unison always sounded like gunshots to a native of the West End. 4 men stepped out. 3 were built like brick walls wearing dark raincoats that didn't hide the bulk of shoulder holsters. The 4th man walked in the center. He didn't wear a raincoat. He moved slowly, seemingly indifferent to the downpour soaking the shoulders of his bespoke navy suit. Leo Moretti. Nora felt the air in her lungs turn to lead. Everyone knew Moretti. He was the reason the local precinct had a brand new fleet of cruisers, and the reason the old union boss was pulled out of the harbor last spring. He didn't run the underworld. He had corporate structured it. He stopped at the threshold of her open bay door. His shoes, polished to a mirror shine, rested inches from a puddle of transmission fluid. "Nora Hayes," he said. His voice wasn't a gravelly growl. It was smooth, conversational, and entirely devoid of warmth. "Shop's closed," Nora said. Her grip on the tire iron tightened. Her knuckles ached. Leo glanced around the garage. His eyes took in the peeling paint, the calendars from 5 years ago, the single hydraulic lift that leaked hydraulic fluid. He didn't look disgusted. He looked like an auditor assessing a ledger. "I know," he said, stepping inside. His men stayed at the threshold. The rain hammered against the tin roof, a deafening backdrop to the sudden suffocating quiet in the room. "I'm not here for a tune-up." "Then you're trespassing." A faint, humorless smile touched the corner of his mouth. "I bought the bank that holds the mortgage on this garage yesterday morning. I bought the 2 lots on either side of you this afternoon. By legal definition, I'm practically your landlord." Nora's stomach plummeted, but she kept her chin up. "The mortgage is paid. Mostly. You can't just evict me." "I don't want to evict you, Nora." He reached into the inner pocket of his suit jacket. Nora shifted her weight, preparing to swing the iron if he pulled a weapon. Instead, he pulled out a crisp, folded piece of heavy stock paper. He stepped forward, bridging the gap between them, and placed it on the hood of the Honda. He didn't say a word. He just tapped the paper once with a long, pale finger. Nora didn't touch it. She leaned over to look. It was a cashier's check, issued by a legitimate downtown bank. Made out to her. $1 million. The Waterfront Redevelopment Project. Leo said, his tone casual, as if discussing the weather. "The City Council approved the zoning changes this morning. This block is going to be a high-rise luxury complex. My complex. I need this land. The $1 million is for your trouble, your silence, and your immediate departure. You have until Friday to clear out." It was a fortune. It was enough to pay off the medical debt her father left behind when the cancer finally took him. It was enough to leave this rotting neighborhood and never look back. It was also blood money. Nora looked up from the check. Leo was watching her. He expected her to cry, to thank him, to snatch the paper like a starving dog. He was looking at her the way he looked at everyone, like a problem he had already solved. No. The word hung in the air. Leo's eyes narrowed by a fraction of a millimeter. Excuse me. I said no. Nora picked up the check by the very edge, as if it were contaminated. She flicked her wrist, tossing it back at him. It fluttered, landing on the floor near his Italian leather shoes. My father built this shop. He bled into this concrete. You think I'm going to sell it so you can build a glass tower to launder your racketeering money? Get out. The three men at the door tensed their hands, dipping toward their coats. Leo held up a hand. A silent command. The men froze. He looked down at the check on the floor. Then he looked at Nora. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. He didn't yell. He didn't threaten her. He simply tilted his head, studying her face with a strange, clinical fascination. You're making a mistake, Mrs. Hayes. A very loud, very permanent mistake. It's my mistake to make... She snapped, stepping closer, the tire iron white-knuckled in her hand. Take your check, take your goons, and get off my property. Leo stared at her for a long, heavy moment. Then slowly he bent down and picked up the check. He slipped it back into his pocket. Have a good night, Nora, he said softly. He turned and walked out into the rain. The doors of the SUVs slammed shut. The engines roared, and within seconds they were gone, leaving only tire tracks and the smell of exhaust. Nora dropped the tire iron. It clanged against the concrete. Her hands were shaking violently. She had just signed her own death warrant. The West End had a collective sixth sense for violence. By noon the next day, everyone knew. Word bled through the neighborhood faster than a spilled pint on a bar room floor. Nora Hayes had spit in Leo Moretti's face. Nora didn't sleep. She sat in the dark office overlooking the garage, a pump-action shotgun resting across her knees, a pot of black coffee turning to sludge on the hot plate. Every passing siren made her heart hammer against her ribs. Every shadow stretching across the frosted glass of her bay doors looked like a man with a Molotov cocktail. She knew how Moretti worked. He didn't do messy drive-bys. He did quiet, devastating ruin. A fire started by faulty wiring. A sudden, brutal mugging gone wrong. Morning broke grey and miserable. The garage was still standing. At 8 a.m., a heavy delivery truck rumbled into her lot. Nora racked a shell into the chamber of the shotgun, standing up so fast her chair tipped over. She watched through the blinds. It wasn't a hit squad. It was a Mack Tools truck. Nora crept downstairs, leaving the shotgun behind the counter, and slid the side door open. The driver, a guy named Stan, who had cut her off a month ago due to her unpaid credit line, hopped out of the cab. He didn't look menacing. He looked terrified. Morning, Nora. Stan choked out, wiping sweat from his brow despite the chill. Stan, what are you doing here? I told you I don't have the cash for the back payments yet. Stan flinched. It's paid, Nora. The whole account. Paid in full. He hurried to the back of the truck, throwing open the doors. Plus, I got a delivery. Top-tier diagnostic rig. 2 new heavy-duty impact wrenches. A full master socket set. Nora stepped out onto the wet asphalt. I didn't order any of that. The invoice says you did. Stan said, not meeting her eyes. He shoved a clipboard at her. Just sign for it, please. I just want to drop this off and go. Nora looked at the invoice. The billing address was a shell corporation she recognized from a news article about the waterfront development. Moretti. Take it back. Nora said, her voice hard. Nora, please. Stan begged, his voice cracking. The guy who paid... He said if I didn't deliver this perfectly intact by 8:30 a.m., he was going to repossess my truck, with me in it. Just sign the damn paper. She signed it. She watched numb as Stan unloaded $10,000 worth of pristine high-end equipment into her failing shop, then peeled out of the lot like the devil was chasing him. It didn't stop there. At noon, a crew of private contractors in unmarked vans pulled up. Before Nora could even march out to yell at them, they set up ladders and began patching the leaks in her roof. When she threatened to call the cops, the foreman just tipped his hard hat. "Cops sent us, ma'am, specifically the captain. Said there was a municipal grant for local businesses to maintain structural integrity. Won't cost you a dime." Nora felt like she was losing her mind. The neighborhood watched from a distance. Old man Miller, who ran the diner across the street, stood in his window with a dish towel, his mouth hanging open. Everyone was waiting for the punchline. By sunset, a grey van parked at the end of her alley. 2 men in work clothes got out and installed a high-definition security camera on the telephone pole. Nora marched out into the cold air. "Hey, what are you pointing that at?" The installer looked down from his ladder. "The street, miss. Got orders to make sure nobody messes with this shop." It was a cage, a gilded, suffocating cage. Moretti wasn't burning her out. He was claiming her. He was showing the entire city and her that he owned the air she breathed, the roof over her head, and the tools in her hands. He was stripping away her independence, rendering her defiance completely impotent. It was worse than a beating. It was psychological warfare. He wanted her to break. He wanted her to come crawling to him, confused, indebted, and desperate. She walked back into the shop, staring at the gleaming new diagnostic machine. She picked up a heavy ball-peen hammer from the workbench. She raised it ready to smash the glass screen to pieces. She froze. Smashing it was a reaction. It was a tantrum. It was exactly what a cornered, panicked animal would do. Nora lowered the hammer. She took a deep breath, the smell of oil and old dust grounding her. Moretti wanted to play a game. Fine. She would play, but she wouldn't play on his board. She went to the bathroom, washed the grease from her hands with gritty pumice soap, and changed out of her coveralls into a clean black sweater and jeans. She grabbed her leather jacket and her keys. She was going to the Lion's Den. The Cobalt Room sat on the top floor of a restored Art Deco building downtown. It was an exclusive restaurant, the kind of place where a steak cost more than Nora's weekly grocery budget, and the waitstaff wore better suits than the politicians dining there. It was also widely known as Leo Moretti's unofficial boardroom. Nora bypassed the valet parking her battered primer grey '87 pickup truck between a Bentley and a Mercedes. The valet opened his mouth to object, took one look at the murder in Nora's eyes, and wisely decided to look the other way. She took the gold-plated elevator up. When the doors chimed open, the low murmur of wealthy patrons and the clinking of crystal glasses washed over her. The maitre d', a tall man with a severe haircut, stepped in front of her immediately. "I am sorry, madam. This is a private establishment. If you don't have a reservation, I'm looking for Moretti." Nora said, her voice cutting through the ambient noise like a serrated blade. A few heads turned. The maitre d' stiffened. "I will have to ask you to leave. Security." "Let her through." The voice came from the back of the room, from a circular booth bathed in shadows and the dim glow of amber wall sconces. The maitre d' instantly backed away, dipping his head. Nora walked across the thick plush carpet. Her heavy boots felt loud, out of place, but she refused to soften her stride. She reached the booth. Leo Moretti sat alone. A half-finished glass of red wine and a plate of rare steak sat in front of him. He was wearing a black dress shirt, the collar unbuttoned, looking remarkably relaxed for a man who had a city by the throat. He gestured to the empty leather seat across from him. "You look tense, Nora. Sit." "I prefer standing." Leo took a slow sip of his wine, his dark eyes fixed on her. "You have a habit of refusing my offers. It's becoming a pattern." Nora slammed both her hands flat on the mahogany table, making the silverware rattle. "What the hell is your game, Moretti?" "Game." He arched a brow. The tools, the roof, the cameras. She leaned in her face inches from his across the table. She could smell his cologne, something sharp and expensive like cedar and cold wind. You think you can buy me with a diagnostic machine because I wouldn't take the $1 million. You think I'm going to roll over because you put a patch on my ceiling. Leo didn't flinch at her outburst. He set his wine glass down with careful, deliberate precision. I think you need tools to run a garage. I think a leaking roof is bad for business. And I think a woman living alone in a garage in the West End with a pissed-off cartel element operating 2 blocks away needs a security camera. I don't need your protection. Everyone needs protection, Nora. He said, his voice dropping an octave, losing the conversational lightness. You turned down $1 million. Do you know how that looks to the people in my world? It makes me look weak. It makes people think I have a blind spot. So you suffocate me with charity to prove you own me. Nora laughed a harsh, cynical sound. You're sick. Leo leaned forward. The ambient light caught the sharp angles of his jaw. The casual indifference was gone, replaced by a quiet, simmering intensity. If I wanted to own you, Nora, you wouldn't be standing here yelling at me. I could have foreclosed on the shop. I could have had the city condemn the building. I could have made you vanish. He held her gaze, and for the first time, Nora saw the absolute terrifying truth in his eyes. He wasn't playing a game. But I didn't. Why? She demanded, her voice dropping to a harsh whisper. Why not just burn me out like you do everyone else? Leo stared at her. He looked at the defiance in the set of her shoulders, the dirt under her fingernails that no pumice soap could scrub away, the sheer, unadulterated anger in her eyes. In a world full of yes-men, terrified victims, and greedy opportunists, she was a striking, jagged anomaly. Because, Leo said softly, leaning back into the shadows of the booth, you're the first person in 5 years who looked me in the eye and told me to go to hell. You didn't negotiate. You didn't beg. You just stood your ground. Nora felt a chill race down her spine. The absolute sincerity in his voice was far more dangerous than a threat. I don't want your respect, Moretti. I want to be left alone. That's a tragedy. Leo replied, a ghost of a smile returning to his lips. Because you are now the most interesting thing in this city to me. The $1 million offer is off the table. Good. I don't want the land anymore, Nora, he said, picking up his wine glass again. But I do want something else. Nora stood up straight, suddenly feeling like the air in the room was too thin to breathe. She had walked in here to fight a bully, but she realized too late she had walked into a cage with a predator who had just decided he liked the taste of her resistance. Stay away from my shop, she said. It sounded less like a threat and more like a plea. Leo took a sip of his wine. Drive safe, Nora. The roads are slick tonight. She turned and walked away, feeling his eyes on her back the entire way to the elevator. She had kept her shop. She had won the battle. But as the elevator doors closed, shielding her from the cobalt room, she knew with terrifying certainty that the war had just begun. The West End didn't forget easily, but it did know how to look the other way. For a week, Hayes Automotive existed in a bizarre, quarantined vacuum. Customers cancelled their appointments. Old Man Miller stopped bringing over day-old coffee. The entire neighborhood treated Nora's garage like a radioactive site. Nora spent the days pacing the concrete floor, organizing the pristine tools she didn't ask for, and staring at the flashing red light of the security camera on the telephone pole. She was going broke, just in a much more secure building. On Tuesday afternoon, the low rumble of a flatbed tow truck shook the bay doors. Nora walked out, wiping her hands on a rag, expecting a customer who hadn't heard the neighborhood gossip. Instead, she watched a driver in a generic gray uniform unchain a 1969 Ford Mustang Mach 1. It was painted a matte predatory black. It was also completely ruined. The windshield was shattered in a spiderweb pattern that distinctly resembled bullet holes. The front left fender was crumpled like a soda can, and a thick trail of black oil bled onto the asphalt. The driver dropped the bed, let the Mustang roll into her lot, handed her the keys without a word, and drove off. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb a minute later. Leo Moretti stepped out. He was dressed down today, a dark charcoal overcoat over a simple black sweater, though the clothes still looked like they cost more than her shop. He walked up to the Mustang and ran a hand over the ruined fender. "It took 2 slugs to the engine block," he said, his voice flat. "Radiator is shot. Transmission feels sloppy." Nora crossed her arms. She looked at the bullet holes, then at the mob boss standing in her driveway. "Take it to a body shop." "I don't need bodywork. I need it to run." He turned to look at her. His dark eyes were unreadable. "You're a mechanic, Nora. I'm a paying customer. I don't work on cars tied to homicides." "Nobody died in this car," Leo said. "The man driving it ducked. He's currently enjoying a very long vacation in Florida. I just need the engine rebuilt." "Why me? You have an entire city of people on your payroll." "Because you need the money," he replied, stating a simple, brutal fact. "Your ledger is empty this week. Your regulars are terrified of me. If I don't give you business, you fold by the end of the month. Then I win anyway." Nora hated how easily he dismantled her defenses. He wasn't yelling. He was just dealing cards from a stacked deck. She looked at the Mustang. It was a beautiful machine, abused and neglected. Beneath the fear and the anger, the mechanic in her itched to open the hood. 10 grand, Nora said, her voice hard. "Parts and labor. Paid up front. In cash." Leo didn't blink. He reached into his coat, pulled out a thick manila envelope, and tossed it onto the hood of the Mustang. "I'll be back on Friday," he said. "It's a complete rebuild Moretti. That takes 3 weeks, assuming I can source a 351 Windsor block by tomorrow." "Friday," Leo repeated, turning his back to her and walking toward his sedan. "I suggest you start now." Nora spent the next 3 days living on black coffee and spite. She ordered the parts with the cash he left, paying a premium for overnight freight delivery. She slept on a cot in the office for 2 hours a night. She tore the engine down to the block, her hands stained black, her muscles aching with a familiar, punishing burn. Working on the car was a distraction. It was a mechanical problem with a logical solution. Unlike Leo Moretti. On Thursday night, the rain returned, drumming a steady hypnotic beat against the tin roof. Nora was underneath the Mustang, a headlamp illuminating the undercarriage, as she wrenched the new transmission into place. The heavy bay door creaked open. Nora didn't jump. She just tightened her grip on the torque wrench. She slid out from under the car on the creeper, staring at the doorway. Leo was standing there. It was 2 a.m. He wasn't flanked by guards. He was alone, a wet umbrella dripping onto the concrete. He pulled a wooden stool from the corner, dragged it near the front bumper, and sat down. "You're early," Nora said, wiping grease from her cheek. "I couldn't sleep." "Try warm milk, or counting all the people you've extorted." Leo let out a low, rough chuckle. It was a surprisingly human sound. "You have a vicious mouth, Nora. You have a terrible personality. We all have our flaws." She slid back under the car. She wasn't going to stop working just because he decided to haunt her garage. For an hour, the only sounds were the rain and the metallic clatter of her tools. Leo didn't speak. He just sat there watching her work. It wasn't a sexual gaze. It was analytical. He watched her hands, the way she problem-solved, the sheer brute force she applied to stripped bolts. "My father was a butcher," Leo said suddenly. His voice echoed slightly in the cavernous room. Nora paused, a wrench suspended in the air. She didn't say anything. He worked 14 hours a day slicing prime cuts of meat for rich people in the North End, then came home, and fed us the scraps. Leo continued his tone detached, as if reciting a Wikipedia article about a stranger. He owed money to a loan shark. The shark broke his hands with a ball-peen hammer when I was 12. He never worked again. He died a miserable, broken man. Nora slid out from under the car, sitting up. She looked at him. The shadows hid half his face, but the coldness in his eyes was absolute. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. "Because I want you to understand me," Leo said. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on his knees. "I don't break people's hands, Nora. I buy the loan shark. I buy the butcher shop. I buy the neighborhood. Power isn't violence. Power is control." "And what happens when someone doesn't want to be controlled?" Leo looked at her, his gaze heavy and fixed. "Then I sit in a cold garage at 2 in the morning trying to figure out why." The problem with being noticed by a man like Leo Moretti is that his enemies notice you too. Friday morning arrived with a biting, bitter wind. The Mustang was finished. It sat in the center of the bay, the engine purring with a deep, guttural menace that rattled the tools on the pegboard. Nora was exhausted, her hands cut and blistered, but she felt a fierce pride. She had beaten his deadline. At noon, a silver Lincoln Navigator pulled into the lot. It wasn't Leo's style. His crew drove black. Nora stood by the workbench grabbing a heavy steel crowbar. Survival in the West End was about pattern recognition, and this broke the pattern. 3 men got out. They wore heavy leather jackets and work boots. They didn't have the disciplined, tailored look of Moretti's men. They looked hungry, mean, and eager to prove a point. The O'Shea Syndicate. They ran the docks on the south side and had been fighting a losing turf war against Leo for 6 months. The leader, a guy with a jagged scar running through his left eyebrow, walked straight into the garage. He looked at the pristine diagnostic machine, the new roof patches, and finally the Mustang. "Nice setup," the scarred man said. He spat a wad of gum onto the concrete. "Word on the street is the Ice King finally thawed out for a grease monkey. Shops closed," Nora said. Her voice was steady, but her heart was hammering against her ribs. She was alone. The shotgun was behind the counter, 15 feet away. "We're not here for an oil change, sweetheart." The man smirked. He pulled a baseball bat from inside his coat. The other 2 men pulled heavy steel pipes. "Moretti took a shipment of ours yesterday, so we're taking something of his. To send a message." He swung the bat. It smashed into the front headlight of the Mustang, shattering the glass and denting the pristine black metal. Rage, pure and blinding, eclipsed Nora's fear. That was her work, her blood and sweat. The man raised the bat again, turning toward the new diagnostic machine. Nora didn't think. She moved. She hurled the heavy steel crowbar like a javelin. It caught the scarred man squarely in the ribs. He let out a breathless grunt, dropping the bat as he staggered backward. The other 2 men rushed her. Nora ducked a wild swing from a steel pipe, the wind of it rushing past her ear. She drove her shoulder into the attacker's chest, using his momentum to slam him into the side of the heavy hydraulic lift. He hit the steel hard, gasping for air. But there were 3 of them. The third man grabbed her by the back of her jacket, throwing her onto the concrete. The floor scraped the skin off her palms. She scrambled backward, kicking out blindly, her boots connecting with a kneecap. "Hold her down!" the scarred man yelled, recovering his breath. His face red with fury, he picked up his bat. "Break her hands." Nora lunged for the counter. Her fingers brushed the cold steel of the shotgun barrel. Before she could pull it, the air outside shattered. It wasn't a warning shot. It was a precise, deafening crack. The man holding the steel pipe screamed, dropping his weapon as a bullet tore through his shoulder. He collapsed, clutching his arm, blood pooling onto the oil-stained floor. The scarred man froze. Leo Moretti stood in the open bay door. He held a suppressed pistol in his right hand, aimed squarely at the scarred man's chest. The quiet, analytical man from the night before was gone. In his place was a predator devoid of hesitation, radiating absolute violence. Two of his enforcers flanked him, their weapons drawn. "Drop it," Leo said. The command barely registered above a whisper, but it carried the weight of a death sentence. The bat clattered to the floor. The scarred man raised his hands, his face completely drained of color. "Leo, listen, this was just business. A message. You came into my city." Leo interrupted, walking forward. His eyes never left the scarred man. "You walked into this shop, and you threatened her." "She broke my ribs." The man panicked. Leo didn't smile. He raised the gun and shot the man in the right kneecap. The sound was muffled, but the scream was not. The man crumpled to the floor, writhing in agony. Nora flinched, pressing her back against the counter, her breath coming in short, jagged gasps. She had seen violence before, but never this surgical, never this cold. Leo looked down at the three men bleeding on her floor. "Clean this up," he told his enforcers. "If O'Shea wants to send messages, tell him I'm returning to sender. Take them to the docks. Make sure they don't walk again." His men moved with terrifying efficiency, dragging the groaning men out to the Lincoln. Leo lowered his gun and turned to Nora. She was still on the floor, her hands bleeding, her clothes covered in dust. He didn't offer his hand. He just looked at her, his jaw tight. "Are you hurt?" "No," she rasped, pulling herself up by the edge of the counter. She looked at the blood on the concrete. You shot them in my shop. They were going to break your hands." Leo said, his voice hard. "You think you can play in this world, Nora? You think your defiance is a shield? This is what happens when you catch my attention. My enemies become your enemies." "I didn't ask for your attention," she screamed, her voice cracking. "I didn't ask for any of this. It doesn't matter." Leo snapped, stepping closer, closing the distance between them. The smell of gunpowder and his cedar cologne was intoxicating and terrifying. "The board is set. You're on it. The only way you survive now is if you stay close to me." Nora stared up at him. She hated him for bringing this to her doorstep. She hated him for being right. But most of all, she hated that when he walked through that door, her first feeling hadn't been fear. It had been relief. The police didn't come. Nobody called them in the West End. Nora spent 3 hours scrubbing the concrete with bleach and an industrial stiff bristle brush, trying to get the coppery smell of blood out of the shop. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw the muzzle flash. She saw Leo's face, a mask of absolute, unforgiving control. By 10 o'clock at night, the shop was locked down. The heavy iron bars were pulled over the windows. The security system was armed. Nora sat in the office upstairs, nursing a glass of cheap whiskey, staring blindly at the security monitors. She was trapped. Leaving meant abandoning her father's legacy and running from a ghost. Staying meant accepting the gilded cage Leo had built for her. At 2:45 a.m., the buzzer at the heavy steel side door rang. Nora jumped, spilling her whiskey. She grabbed the shotgun, racking a shell with a loud metallic clack. She walked to the security monitor. It was Leo. He was alone, leaning heavily against the brick wall. His head was bowed, and in the harsh glare of the sodium street lamp, she could see a dark, wet stain spreading across the side of his charcoal shirt. She should have left him there. She should have called an ambulance or the cops, or simply let the city claim him the way it claimed everyone else. She walked downstairs and undid the deadbolts. She opened the heavy steel door. Leo stumbled forward, barely catching himself on the doorframe. His breathing was shallow and ragged. "What happened?" Nora asked, stepping back to let him in, locking the door instantly behind him. "O'Shea." Leo managed to say, his voice strained. "He didn't like my return policy. Had a team waiting at my penthouse." "You need a hospital." Leo shook his head, leaning against the cinder block wall. "No hospitals. O'Shea has guys in the ER at St. Jude's. And my private doctor is..." Currently unavailable, probably dead. He looked at her, his dark eyes cloudy with pain, but fiercely focused. I need you to patch me up. I fix cars, Moretti, not people. Mechanics know how to stop leaks. He grunted, unbuttoning his shirt with bloody fingers. I have a bullet graze on my ribs. It didn't hit anything vital, but it won't stop bleeding. I need stitches. Nora stared at him. He was arguably the most dangerous man in the city, currently bleeding out in her garage, putting his life entirely in her calloused hands. Sit down, she ordered. She guided him to the heavy wooden chair in her office. She grabbed the first aid kit her father used to keep for shop accidents, a heavy-duty tackle box filled with gauze iodine surgical tape, and a suturing kit he bought off a combat medic years ago. She pulled a pair of nitrile gloves on and turned on the bright, articulated desk lamp, angling it toward him. Leo pulled his shirt open. The wound was ugly. A deep, jagged groove tore through the flesh along his left rib cage, weeping dark red blood. It was a close call. 2 inches to the right, and it would have shattered a rib and punctured a lung. This is going to hurt, Nora said, uncapping a bottle of iodine. I've had worse, Leo muttered. She poured the iodine directly onto a gauze pad and pressed it into the wound. Leo didn't scream, but his entire body went rigid. His jaw locked the muscles in his neck, standing out like steel cables. He gripped the armrests of the wooden chair so hard the wood groaned. Nora worked quickly, her hands surprisingly steady. The panic she felt earlier during the fight was gone, replaced by the cold, mechanical focus she used to rebuild engines. She cleaned the wound, clearing away the debris and coagulated blood. You're very calm. Leo observed his voice a tight rasp. He was watching her face, studying the concentrated set of her brow. Don't talk. I need to stitch. She threaded the curved needle. You didn't hesitate today. He continued, ignoring her order. When they came for you, you fought back. You threw a crowbar through a man's ribs. He was smashing my work, she said, simply pushing the needle through his skin. Leo flinched, a sharp intake of breath hissing through his teeth. You value the work more than your safety. I value what's mine, something you wouldn't understand. You just buy things. She pulled the suture tight, tying it off. Hold still. I understand better than you think. He looked away, staring at the peeling wallpaper of her office. When I saw him swing that bat at you, it wasn't about the car, or the disrespect. Nora paused, the needle hovering over his skin. She looked up at him. His guard was down. The blood loss, the pain, the late hour, it had stripped away the polished corporate mobster veneer. He just looked tired. Then what was it about? She asked, her voice softer than she intended. Leo turned his head, his dark eyes locking onto hers. The intensity in them made her breath hitch. It was about the fact that if he touched you, I was going to burn the entire South Side to the ground. And that terrified me. Nora stared at him. The silence in the office was absolute, broken only by the sound of the rain outside and their shallow breathing. He wasn't playing a game anymore. This was a confession, an admission of a weakness he couldn't afford and a vulnerability she didn't want. She looked back down her heart, pounding a frantic rhythm against her ribs. She took another stitch, her hands slightly less steady than before. You're an idiot, she whispered, tying the knot. I know, Leo said softly. She finished the stitches, taping a heavy gauze pad over the wound. She peeled off the bloody gloves and tossed them into the trash can. She walked over to the sink in the corner, washing her hands with harsh soap, keeping her back to him. She didn't know how to navigate this. Anger was easy. Defiance was a reflex. But this quiet, bleeding man sitting in her office, tying his survival to hers, was tearing down the walls she had spent years building. You can sleep on the cot, Nora said, not turning around. "I'll keep watch on the monitors." "Nora." She stopped. She turned around. Leo was standing. He looked pale, but the bleeding had stopped. He walked toward her, his steps slow but deliberate. He stopped inches away from her. He was taller than her, his presence dominating the small office. He reached out his hand, wrapping gently around her wrist. His thumb brushed over the raw, scraped skin on her palm where she had fallen earlier. His touch was incredibly gentle, completely at odds with the violence he had unleashed hours ago. "I told you I wanted you to understand me," Leo said, his voice a low murmur. "I don't walk away from things I claim, and I don't let anyone touch what's mine." He didn't wait for her to argue. He let go of her wrist, turned, and walked over to the small cot in the corner, lying down with a heavy sigh. Within minutes, his breathing evened out, slipping into an exhausted sleep. Nora stood by the sink for a long time. She looked at her scraped palm, where the phantom heat of his touch still lingered. She was in too deep. The $1 million would have cost her her soul, but Leo Moretti was going to cost her everything else. Dawn crept into the West End like a thief, painting the cinder-block walls of the office in bruised shades of purple and grey. Nora hadn't slept. She sat at her desk, an empty coffee mug in her hands, watching the steady rise and fall of Leo's chest on the cot. The security monitors bathed the room in a pale blue glow. Outside, the street was dead. No cars, no pedestrians. It was the kind of quiet that precedes a hurricane. Leo stirred a sharp hiss, escaping his teeth, as he shifted his weight. He opened his eyes. They were instantly alert, devoid of the grogginess most people had upon waking. He looked at the ceiling, then at his bandaged side, and finally at Nora. "You're still here," he said, his voice gravelly. "It's my garage. Where else would I be?" Leo sat up, slowly testing the stitches. He didn't wince again, but a thin sheen of sweat broke out on his forehead. "You need to pack a bag. Just the essentials. Clothes, any cash you have in the safe, and that shotgun." Nora set her mug down. "I'm not leaving. O'Shea knows I'm hurt," Leo said, standing up. He grabbed his blood-stained shirt from the floor and threw it in the trash, pulling his dark overcoat directly over his bare, heavily tattooed chest. "He knows his hit squad failed. He's going to tear the city apart looking for me, and he'll start with the places I've been recently. He'll start here. I have the security shutters. The doors are reinforced steel. Nora." Leo walked over to her desk. He leaned over, placing both hands flat on the scarred wood. "Steel doors stop street thugs. They don't stop a crew of 20 men with automatic weapons and a point to prove. If you stay here, you die." "My father. Your father is dead," Leo said brutally. Nora flinched as if he had slapped her. "I'm sorry," Leo said, though his tone was uncompromising. "But his ghost can't protect you from what's coming. The only thing keeping you alive right now is mobility." Nora looked at the framed photograph on her desk. Her dad, smiling, covered in grease, holding up a wrench. She had spent the last 5 years slowly suffocating under his medical debt, tying her entire identity to this cracked concrete floor. She had fought tooth and nail for it. She had turned down $1 million for it. The shrill blare of the proximity alarm shattered the silence. Nora's head snapped toward the monitors. 3 black panel vans were idling at the end of the alley. Men were pouring out of the back doors. They didn't have bats or pipes this time. They had tactical vests. They had assault rifles. And one of them was holding a heavy glass bottle with a flaming rag stuffed in the neck. "They're early," Leo said. He reached over her desk, grabbing her arm. "Move, now." Nora didn't argue. The sight of the Molotov cocktail paralyzed her for a fraction of a second, then survival instinct took over. She grabbed the canvas duffel bag she kept for emergencies, sweeping the meager stacks of cash from her lockbox into it. She grabbed the shotgun. Out the back." Nora ordered, her voice eerily calm. "Through the utility tunnel. It dumps out behind the diner." They rushed down the metal stairs to the shop floor. The front bay door exploded. The deafening boom of the breaching charge blew the heavy steel hinges clean off the wall. The door buckled inward, crashing onto the hood of the ruined Mustang. Smoke and concrete dust flooded the garage. Automatic gunfire ripped through the air, tearing into the toolboxes, shattering the glass of the new diagnostic machine, shredding the pegboards. "Go!" Leo shoved her toward the back office. He pulled his suppressed pistol, firing blindly into the thick smoke to lay down cover fire. A man screamed in the dust. Nora kicked open the heavy utility door at the rear of the shop. She didn't look back. She couldn't. If she looked back, she would see her life burning down. She plunged into the dark, damp corridor, the smell of mold and old brick, a sharp contrast to the cordite filling her garage. Leo slammed the door shut behind them, throwing the heavy deadbolt just as bullets hammered against the other side, denting the steel. They ran. The tunnel was narrow, built a century ago for coal deliveries. They burst out of the heavy grate behind Old Man Miller's diner into the freezing morning air. Nora's primer grey pickup truck was parked exactly where she'd left it last night, tucked between two dumpsters. It was invisible. It was perfect. She threw the duffel into the cab, sliding into the driver's seat. Leo climbed into the passenger side, his face tight with pain clutching his ribs. Nora shoved the key into the ignition. The old engine sputtered, coughed, and roared to life. She slammed it into gear and tore out of the alley, leaving the West End in the rear-view mirror. A thick column of black smoke was already rising above the rooftops behind them. Nora gripped the steering wheel so hard her knuckles turned bone white. Her chest heaved. She didn't cry. Crying was a luxury for people who had time to mourn. She just stared at the road, her foot pressed heavy on the gas. Leo watched her in the peripheral vision. "I will rebuild it," he said quietly. "Brick by brick, better than it was. I don't want it rebuilt." Nora said, her voice a hollow, dangerous rasp. "I want the men who burned it down." Leo turned to look at her fully. The raw, unfiltered hatred in her eyes mirrored his own. The mechanic from the West End was gone. The fire had burned away the civilian. "Then we go to war," Leo said. The South Side docks smelled of rotting kelp diesel fuel and oxidized metal. Nora killed the headlights of the pickup truck, letting it roll silently to a stop behind a mountain of rusted shipping containers. It was midnight. The rain had returned, a freezing drizzle that slicked the asphalt and swallowed the sound of their approach. 2 blocks away sat Warehouse 4. It was a massive corrugated steel structure surrounded by a chain-link fence topped with razor wire. It was O'Shea's fortress. It held his smuggled shipments, his cash reserves, and tonight it held O'Shea himself. Leo sat in the passenger seat loading a fresh magazine into an assault rifle he had retrieved from a secure drop box an hour ago. He had made exactly 3 phone calls. 6 of his most lethal men were currently getting into position on the perimeter. The perimeter is heavy. Leo set his eyes, scanning the warehouse through a pair of thermal binoculars. 10 guards outside, probably double that inside. The doors are magnetically sealed. The only way my team gets in without triggering a lockdown is if the main power grid goes dark. "You said they have backups," Nora said, checking the chamber of her shotgun. "A diesel generator in the detached utility shed on the north side," Leo confirmed. "If we cut the city line, the generator kicks in within 4 seconds. It won't give us enough time to breach the magnetic locks." "Then we don't cut the city line," Nora said. She pulled a heavy canvas tool roll from the back seat, unrolling it on her lap. Wrenches, wire cutters, heavy-duty pliers gleamed in the dim dashboard light. "We sabotage the generator first. We bleed the fuel lines, fry the alternator. When the main power drops, the backup chokes." Leo looked at her. "The utility shed is guarded." "Then you shoot the guard." Nora replied coldly. And I killed the engine. It was a staggering shift. 3 days ago she was kicking him out of her shop. Now she was plotting the tactical sabotage of a mob stronghold. Leo didn't argue. He just nodded. They slipped out of the truck, moving like ghosts through the labyrinth of shipping containers. The rain soaked through Nora's leather jacket, but she didn't feel the cold. She felt only a sharp, buzzing adrenaline. They reached the edge of the fence line. The utility shed was a low, concrete bunker 50 yards away. A single guard stood beneath a halogen spotlight, smoking a cigarette, his rifle slung over his shoulder. Leo raised his suppressed pistol. He exhaled a long breath, steadying his aim. Foot! The guard folded silently, dropping the cigarette, his body hitting the wet concrete with a dull thud. Go, Leo whispered. Nora ran. She stayed low, her boots splashing softly in the puddles, keeping her eyes fixed on the shed. She reached the door. It was locked with a heavy padlock. She pulled a pair of heavy bolt cutters from her tool roll, clamped them onto the hardened steel shackle, and threw her entire body weight onto the handles. With a sharp crack, the lock snapped. She slipped inside. The shed was stiflingly hot, dominated by a massive industrial Caterpillar diesel generator. It was humming quietly in standby mode, waiting for a power drop. Nora didn't hesitate. She knew engines. She knew how they breathed, how they bled, and how they died. She crawled under the massive machine, clicking on a small pen light. She found the main fuel line, a thick, braided steel hose feeding the injectors. She didn't cut it. Cutting it would trigger a pressure sensor and sound an alarm. Instead, she took a heavy wrench and loosened the coupling just enough to break the seal. Diesel began to weep, pooling onto the concrete floor. Next, she stood up, opening the heavy side panel. She found the primary alternator belt. She pulled a heavy utility knife from her pocket, slicing the thick rubber 3/4 of the way through. The moment the generator tried to pull a load, the belt would snap. Done, Nora whispered into the radio Leo had given her. Copy. Leo's voice crackled back. My team is at the main breaker box, cutting city power in 3, 2, 1. Outside, the massive halogen spotlights surrounding the warehouse abruptly died. The entire dockyard plunged into pitch blackness. Inside the shed, the Caterpillar generator roared to life with a deafening mechanical scream. The heavy pistons fired. The room filled with the smell of unburnt diesel. Nora backed against the wall. The generator ran for exactly 3 seconds. The weakened alternator belt snapped with a sound like a gunshot. The engine choked, starved of fuel from the bleeding line, the computer throwing a cascade of fatal errors. It sputtered, coughed out a cloud of black smoke, and died completely. Silence slammed back down on the docks. The magnetic locks on the warehouse doors disengaged with a heavy metallic clunk. Then the gunfire started. It wasn't a shootout. It was an execution. Leo's men breached the doors with military precision. Nora stood in the dark shed, listening to the muffled shouts, the staccato bursts of automatic fire, the shattering of glass. She didn't hide. She gripped her shotgun, her eyes fixed on the door, waiting. 10 minutes later, the gunfire faded into a heavy, oppressive silence. The radio at her hip clicked. It's clear, Leo's voice said. It was perfectly calm, devoid of any adrenaline or exertion. Nora stepped out of the shed. The warehouse doors were wide open. Inside, emergency chemical lights bathed the massive space in an eerie neon green glow. Bodies in leather jackets littered the concrete floor. Leo was standing in the center of the room. He was looking down at O'Shea. The scarred man who had smashed her Mustang was on his knees. He was bleeding heavily from his shoulder and his leg. He looked up at Leo, his face twisted in a mask of absolute terror. Nora walked forward, her boots crunching over broken glass and spent brass casings. Leo glanced at her as she approached. He didn't tell her to look away. He didn't try to shield her from the brutality of his world. "You burned her shop," Leo said, looking down at O'Shea. His voice echoed in the cavernous space. "Moretti, please. We can make a deal. I'll give you the docks. I'll give you the shipping lanes." O'Shea was hyperventilating, blood bubbling at the corner of his mouth. "I already have the docks," Leo replied softly. "I took them 10 minutes ago." Leo raised his pistol. "Wait," Nora said. Leo paused, his finger resting lightly on the trigger. He looked at her, a question in his dark eyes. Was she backing out? Was the civilian conscience finally kicking in? Nora looked at O'Shea. She saw the man who had ordered the firebomb. She saw the man who had reduced her father's legacy to ash and forced her to run like a rat in the dark. She didn't feel pity. She felt absolute, freezing clarity. "My shop was worth a lot more than a bullet," Nora said. She turned and walked out of the warehouse into the freezing rain. She didn't wait to hear the gunshot. It came 3 seconds later, a single sharp crack that echoed across the water, finalizing the transfer of power. Nora leaned against the hood of her primer grey truck, letting the rain wash the smell of diesel and smoke from her skin. The war was over, but she knew with absolute certainty that she couldn't go back to the person she was before the fire. A week later, the sun broke through the heavy autumn clouds, casting a cold, brilliant light over the West End. Nora stood on the sidewalk staring at the charred shell of Hayes Automotive. The roof had caved in. The walls were scorched black. Yellow police tape fluttered weakly in the wind. The smell of wet ash was still thick in the air. A sleek black sedan pulled up to the curb behind her. Leo got out. He was back in a pristine, tailored charcoal suit. The bandages beneath his shirt barely restricted his movement anymore. The city was his uncontested. The news was calling O'Shea's death a syndicate dispute. The police were looking the other way. The machine was running perfectly. He walked up beside her, staring at the ruins. He reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a thick, legal-sized envelope. He held it out to her. "What's this?" Nora asked, not taking it. "The deed to this lot," Leo said. "Free and clear. No mortgage, no shell corporations. It's in your name completely. There's also a cashier's check inside, enough to rebuild the shop, buy new equipment, and keep it running for a decade." Nora stared at the envelope. It was everything she had fought for. It was absolute independence. There are no strings. Nora, Leo continued, his voice softer than she had ever heard it. "No cameras, no forced deliveries. If you want, I will walk away right now. You will never see me again. I owe you my life, and this is my debt paid." He was giving her exactly what she asked for on the very first night they met. He was giving her a way out. Nora looked at the envelope, then at the ashes of her garage. She imagined rebuilding it. She imagined spending the next 10 years fixing carburetors and doing oil changes for people who complained about hourly rates. She imagined going back to the quiet, desperate struggle of being a nobody in a dying neighborhood. It sounded agonizingly boring. The fire hadn't just burned down the building, it had burned down her tolerance for a mediocre life. She had stood in a darkened shed and crippled a mob boss's fortress. She had stitched up a kingpin while he confessed his deepest fears. She had tasted the voltage of true power, and she couldn't go back to a 12-volt battery. Nora reached out, but she didn't take the envelope. Instead, she placed her hand flat against Leo's chest, right over his heart. She could feel the steady, powerful rhythm beneath the expensive wool of his suit. "I don't want a garage anymore," Nora said, holding his gaze. Leo's breath hitched a microscopic break in his perfect composure. "What do you want?" "I want the Cobalt Room," she said, her voice low, thrumming with quiet authority. "I want a seat at the table. If I'm going to live in this city, I'm not hiding under a car anymore. I want to build something that doesn't burn." Leo looked down at her. For the first time since she met him, a genuine, unguarded smile broke across his face. It wasn't the cold smirk of a mobster. It was the fierce, predatory joy of a man who had finally found an equal. He dropped the envelope onto the hood of his sedan. He didn't need to buy her. He never did. He reached up his hand, tangling in her dark hair, pulling her flush against him. His kiss was exactly like him, ruthless, demanding, and utterly consuming. Nora kissed him back with equal ferocity, her hands gripping the lapels of his suit, anchoring herself to the storm she had chosen to walk into. The West End watched from their windows, whispering behind drawn curtains. They thought they knew the story. They thought the mob boss had broken the mechanic. They were wrong. He didn't break her. He weaponized her, and the city would never be the same. That's the explosive conclusion to Nora and Leo's story. Sometimes the only way to survive the darkness is to learn how to rule it. If this gritty, high-stakes romance kept you on the edge of your seat, smash that like button and subscribe for more original stories that skip the cliches and go straight for the throat. Share this video with anyone who loves a fiercely independent heroine and a morally grey anti-hero. Drop a comment below. Would you have walked away with the deed or taken the empire? See you in the next one.